the gender wage gap has attracted a lot of attention recently, but, and this is not well known, or hasn't attracted as much attention until now, the gender wage gap is really a shift in statistics. So usually we are used to hear sentences like women make 80 cents to the men's dollar, and that gap, which I would say it's a gap of 20%, it is true. That's on average is the gender wage gap in the US and across a variety of countries. However, this is really little, much less well known. The gender wage gap actually widens with age. So, for example, if you look at people in my cohort, so college graduate in my cohort, born circa 1970, you would find that the gender earnings gap at age 25 is about 10%, but by age 39, we're up to 55%. So there is a huge, and this is the raw gap, so we're not controlling for differences in occupation or industry in which people work and so forth. So this fact, we thought that would be very interesting to try to unpack. First of all, actually document this widening of the gender pay gap over people's life cycle, especially over, we'll get back to that later, and also try to gain a better understanding of what were the sources for this widening, okay? So in general, the literature has shown that part of this difference, it is indeed due to differences in the type of occupation women are in. So women tend to be in occupation where there is a lower wage growth. Perhaps they are specialized nurses, or they are educators. And those are professions where wages don't grow substantially over an individual life cycle. Whereas men, perhaps especially college-educated men, disproportionately tend to be working in high-paying professions. However, it is also true that only 1/3 of the overall widening of the gender wage gap over the life cycle of college graduate, only 1/3 of that comes from differences in the type of occupation men and women are in. Most of the difference, actually 2/3, comes from within this occupation, within these industries in which men and women, are working. So we thought that we could use this exceptional large data set that we have been lucky to have access to try to go a little bit deeper into what are the factors that can explain this widening of the gender pay gap. So the data that we had access to is, I guess it would enter under the category of big data. So we have millions and millions of observations actually covering the entire private sector in the US. From the years between 1995 and 2008. So we have, on the one hand, this data that follows career trajectories of workers as they kind of progress in their career within establishment, within firms, and as they move from working from one firm to another. So we have really very detailed information about both the employers and the employees over this period. But in addition to that, we had access to something that is quite unique, which is the linkage between these longitudinal data set of workers and their employers to the characteristics of the employees as of 2000. That is, basically this data, we link employees to themselves in the 2000 Census of the United States. And these allow us to have information that are typically not available in the other type of data set. And these are the workers' education, their marital status, whether they have children or not, their detail level, their detailed occupations. If they're married, what does their spouse do? What's their occupation? What's their income? Okay, these are all features of the data that are invaluable if we want to understand what are the root causes for the widening of the gender wage gap. And it's not like we don't know anything, okay? Because the literature has emphasized many different aspects. For example, for college graduate, we have that they tend to work in professions that are very unforgiving of switches to working part-time or small absences even from the job. So we know that component has a role in this, explaining this widening of the gender wage gap. We know that gender norms have a role, and we know also that some policies or the lack thereof might have a role in this widening of the gender wage gap. But what we can do with our data set, we can decompose what is the part of this widening of the gender wage gap that comes from the fact that women and men have different careers within a firm, within an establishment, okay? Versus what part comes from the fact that when we think about wage growth of worker, a lot of the wage growth over early careers, especially over college graduate, comes from people moving from one firm to the next, okay? So before I get to the result, I want to emphasize what is it that we are kind of unpacking. And I think this is one of the reasons why we had attention in the media for this work. What we are unpacking is something that relates to the gender wage gap in the following way. So in the economic theory, how do we think about careers and wage growth? Okay, on the one end, you have job ladders inside a firm. Okay, firms look at their employees, they choose, they get a sense of who is going to has managerial potential and who doesn't. Or if we're talking about law firms, who has partner potential and who doesn't. And a lot of wage growth that occurs within a firm comes from this assessment, internal assessment, and typically working more hours or having a great amount of flexibility, also in terms of traveling schedule, or in terms of, for example, if you work for a big bank, being in the banking sector, say for any large financial company, they might ask you to travel to different establishments within the same firm, and that is going to have to be an input in your career prospect. Okay, so that's one way in which we have careers. Okay, we have also another way in which careers occur and wage growth occurs over people's life cycle, and that's people jumping from one firm to another. Okay, that activity, however, requires a certain amount of effort, in the sense that you have to be able to keep looking for jobs as you are doing your job, and also part of this ability to jump to higher paying firms over, as you grow older, comes from networks. Okay, so both these economic mechanisms within firm and this that comes from workers moving across firms require an additional amount of effort that might not be reconcilable, okay, with having a family, especially when you have young children. Okay, so to the extent that women tend to disproportionately bear to some extent the bulk of childcare, in some cases for obvious reasons. To the extent that that's the case, women have a harder time playing this career game relative to men. So in terms of our finding, we show that the gender earnings gap increases substantially over workers' life cycle from age 25 to 45. So we go, but this widening depends on education. So, for example, let me start from college graduates. So for college graduate, we go from this about 10% gap, raw gap in earnings, to about 55% gap in earnings between men and women by age 45. And what we show is that of this increasing gap, about 60%, 60 to 70% of that increase is due to men better ability to advance their career within firms, okay? With the remaining 30 to 40% instead coming from the fact that men, when they switch job, they tend to switch to better and better paying firm, while that's not the case for women, okay? So now, to further unpack the result, this difference for the college graduate mostly come from married women, okay? In other words, married men, and unmarried women look much alike in their ability to move to higher paying firm as they transition in their career, whereas that's not the case for married women. And although we cannot really get into this, into the causal, what is it that is causing this difference, previous research suggests that this might be because married women tend to be what they call tide movers or time stayers. In other words, let's think about a college-educated married couple. Is typically the case, and let's not enter into the reason why that's the case, then the husband perhaps receive a better job offer in another city, for example, okay? So typically what we see is that the family moves to the new city, the wife, especially if they are in their late 20s, early 30s, the wife might say, okay, I'll quit my job, we'll get to that city, and then I look around for whatever jobs is available, okay? That implies that while his transition from one city to the next, from one job to the next, is associated with gain in wages, for women, that might not be the case, because when you're much more limited opportunities once your search is limited geographically, okay? So this kind of mechanism seems to be playing a relatively large role in, and again, about 30 to 40% of the widening of the gap in explaining the differences in experiences in terms of wage growth between married, college-educated men and women, okay? So when we go to the people with lower level of education, what we find is that there is a much smaller widening of the gender wage gap between men and women from age 25 to age 45. And actually, although this gap widens a little bit between age 25 and 35, by age 45, actually the part of the gap that is coming from the growth, career opportunity within a firm, it completely closes for that group. If anything, women hold a little bit of advantage relative to men. Although there is still some differences in the part of that growing wage inequality between men and women who do not have a college degree that is coming from switching jobs and going to higher paying firm, okay? So now on the one hand, we could say, oh, wow, that's great. Maybe for, why that discrepancy? And I think that, and we haven't quantitatively decomposed this, but part of the reason why for men and women with lower level of education, the opening and the widening of the gender pay gap is less substantial, is because, unfortunately, for lower educated men and women, there are fewer opportunity for wage growth over their life cycle. So it's not so much that whatever is the mechanism that is underlying these differential opportunities of men and women to have career growth and wage growth, is not as bad for in professions that have lower levels of education. Is more that in those professions, wages do not grow as much over your life cycle. So again, in the spirit of trying to unpack then, where this mechanism is stronger, we also look in a companion paper to different industry. So we look at the widening of the gender wage gap as people age within industries such as what we call FIRE, which is financial, insurance, and real estate, and also technology occupation. Once we have controlled actually for many, many factors, including marital status, occupation, very detailed measures of occupations, and so forth, okay? And we find that it is in those industries where we see the largest losses in terms of wage growth over the life cycle for college-educated women. In other words, these are industry where it seems that careers have much larger pay. Women pay a much larger price in terms of their career prospect from from having to work fewer hours or following their husband to a different city or taking some time off when they have a child. And so generally, what we see playing out, I think that the finding of our research are not particularly surprising to many college graduates, women. So if you go, we're in Boston, to a Brookline playground or a playground in Newton, you would actually, and talk to mothers, you will actually find that this type of story resonates. So there are many women who actually, many times in anticipation of having a family, they switch from the higher paying firm to positions within a firm or to firms where, let's say the rat race is less strong. And that's because they know that anyway they would pay a large penalty to having their child, okay? So what is really, I think, important in terms of our research is that we show that this is not just an anecdote, okay? So we show that if you use this big data that have information on almost, the universe of private employees in some state at least, you do actually see that these experiences do have a quantitative impact on the careers and wage growth of men and women, differential ability, again, of playing this career game of college men and women. And so I think that our next step, what we really want to do with this data, and what actually we can do with this data that many other studies cannot do because they don't have the link to this demographic information from the census, is to actually go zoom into the family. So our next step would be to really look at within couple earning inequality. So let's zoom in on married couple with college, perhaps working in some sectors of the economy, and then let's follow the career trajectory of this married couple before or after they have children, or things like that, or before and after they experience some kind of health shock, and this could be also, for example, an elderly parent who needs care. Again, women tend to disproportionately take that on, and that affects, that would allow us to really, see how this interaction between what it takes to have a career okay? And what it takes actually to have a family. We want to be able to quantify, in a sense, how much this trade-off does in terms of explaining this widening of the gender wage gap. I think that these findings might help clarify policy recommendations. So many times we hear a discussion of the Swedish style, for example, parental leave policies, where they're certainly more generous than in the US, who's one of the few countries where, as of now, at least at the federal level, the total maternity, the total regulation, I mean, what is mandated is that at the federal level is that women have 12 weeks of unpaid leave, okay? So is that is the solution? Or, do we need a much more organic and structural approach to this problem that involves not just one thing in isolation? It's not just maternity leave policy, but kind of a rethinking of how careers happen on one end, and how what are the resources of families, for instance, to take care of their young children, in conjunction with some form of family leave policies, or other form, on the other hand, firms allowing perhaps a bit more flexibility in their time schedule. So this is a very tough question to answer. And in some other work that I've done recently, I think we have, to some extent, uncovered the reason why. And again, this is nothing exceptionally new. To some extent, it is obvious once you think about it, that when it comes to this issue of policies, as I was saying before, the sentiments are very strong, okay? But also the quantitative answers that come from the literature are very mixed. And there is a reason why they're mixed. So we did recently this, in a sense, it was a meta-studies of many studies that have looked at what is the impact of changes in policies within a country. So, for example, an increase in the week of paid leave from 12 to 15, or things like that, or an extension of childcare, to provide universal preschool childcare for everybody, or quality childcare. So we evaluated the finding of a wide-ranging set of studies that went from these very specific, country-specific studies of specific changes in policies to kind of more broad strokes kind of studies of cross-country comparison of both outcomes of women and policies, as well as our own work, original work on this cross-country comparison. And what we saw two aspects that I want to highlight. The first one is that the reason why it's hard to put a number on whether these policies are effective, as much as we would like to have that number to argue either in favor or against certain types of policy, is that these policies are never unidimensional. So let's start from the maternity leave. We are talking about what is maternity leave, as many different aspects of it, many details that actually might have different consequences. It can be paid or unpaid. It can be mandated or not. Some of the leave may be mandated before giving birth. Some of it cannot. It could be shared between husbands and wife, or maybe not. When it's paid, how much is it paid? What's what we call the average payment rate, which indicates, whether you receive, when you are on maternity leave, 50% or 100% or 80% of your salary. And also, and this is not a minor detail, where is the money coming from? How are we paying for this, for the leave? Okay, so in some countries, the pot of money that is used to pay for parental leave is the same that is used to pay disability insurance. It's another form of, I don't like saying this, but to some extent, it's another form of disability. In some other countries, it comes from the unemployment insurance pot. In some other countries, in some countries you do have some tax kickback to employers, in some you don't. So again, the devil might be in the detail, and some of these policies might have more positive effect on employment than others. So for example, we find that higher average payment rate or parental leave that go above 50 weeks start having actually negative consequences on women's employment. And I think the reason why in the literature, once you examine all possible study, you find very little impact that, in these changes in parental leave is exactly because there are these trade-off. On the one hand, if you can keep your job, that helps you coming back to your job. On the other hand, if you stay out too long, you might have missed a lot of opportunities for career growth. Or if people, once they have a child, stay out of work for 2 years or more than 1 year, that might have negative consequences on firms' willingness to hire women. So this is one aspect. What I think consistently across country, across all sorts of studies, it has been found to have beneficial effect on women's employment, earnings, and fertility, is spending in childcare. So, for example, in Denmark, recently, the legislation changed to provide either subsidies for childcare, early childcare. So we're talking about child quality, actually, childcare for children from age 6 months to 1 year to 2.9, which is when most of preschool start enrolling children, even if it's paid, or either tax breaks for a couple of, or in as usual, in Denmark, in some cases, it's the state that provides this quality childcare. So I think all in all, I would say that the research, what it shows is that if we learn something is that we shouldn't talk about, we should try to put these policies in perspective and think about them organically. And the main message is that making it easier for both mothers and fathers to reconcile careers and work, that's a win-win, okay? Now, of course, we are concerned about costs and other factors. In some cases, change has been, in policies have been proven to be difficult also politically. However, I think there are examples historically that give us hope. So, for example, now recently I'm working on the effect of this act that was called the Lanham Act that happened during World War II. So at a time in which in the U.S. Women's work was necessary, was really a part of the war effort, because men went to war and women had to take those jobs also in war industries. At that time, there were a lot of funding of daycares, preschool, that abruptly ended after the war ended. So, I mean, there are, I think it might be feasible to do it, but I think we want to be very careful about the details of some of these policies and how they can work together. I don't think you can discuss maternity leave policies without discussing, if, we give 6 months of paid leave, and then you have to go back to work. What is the 6-month-old child? Who is going to take care of the child? This is a costly proposition that many times result in women dropping out of the labor force because of all these mechanisms that we have discussed. So, hopefully we'll be able to do more research on these topics with the data, with the increasingly high-quality data that we have access to, and hopefully, and this I say not as just an economist, as in general, hopefully people on both sides of the debate will be kind of able to see that that there is evidence that supports both sides, and so we try, finding the middle ground might be what it takes. But I don't think we can really abstract from solving this problem, especially now that more women than men have college degrees. So this seems more important.